Welcome to my presentation on Poetry Academy, using poetry and vocabulary instruction to build fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, and reading attitudes in struggling third grade readers. I'm Elizabeth EAhlers. I'm a graduate student at Morningside College and a Title I teacher at Grantwood Elementary School. In 2000, the National Reading Panel found that to improve reading instruction, schools needed to incorporate explicit and systematic instruction in both phonemic awareness and phonics, strategies to improve fluency, and have instruction in comprehension and vocabulary. Yet, according to the nation's report card, as of 2015, a third of the nation's fourth graders still could not read proficiently on the NAEP reading tests. In order to be proficient, students need to be able to interpret the texts they are reading and integrate them to help them understand what they are reading. This is where fluency comes into play. Fluency is the bridge between comprehension and word recognition. If students are so focused on that word recognition that their brain power is being used so much on that they can't comprehend. Well, if they can't comprehend, they're not able to pass these tests. So why me? As a reading teacher, I work with many struggling readers. Many of the students I work with are working on phonological awareness and phonics. My building has explicit and systematic resources to teach these skills, but we do not have the same resources for fluency. I wanted to focus my research on fluency so that I could add to the toolbox of interventions for fluency. So my literature review. As I've already said, fluency is that bridge between comprehension and word recognition. Comprehension is much harder when students are not fluent because their brain is working too hard. Fluency is composed of two pieces. Automaticity. This refers to the ability of a reader to decode and recognize words accurately, automatically, and effortlessly. Prosody refers to the expression in which a reader reads. Rosinski describes this as the link between word recognition and comprehension. If a student doesn't have automaticity and prosody, they're at that word-for-word level, that's going to impede their comprehension. There are many fluency instructional strategies out there. The three that I'm going to focus on are all very similar. They are the fluency-oriented reading instruction, WIDE FORI, and the fluency development lesson. All three of these include strategies, teacher modeling, echo reading, choral reading, partner reading, and independent reading. So why poetry? It's short and can be read multiple times in 5 to 10 minutes. It has an authentic purpose for repeated readings with rehearsal of the poems, and it's fun and engaging for students. Poetry Academy is a one-on-one tutoring program that provides an intervention to students once a week for 5 to 10 minutes. It uses the fluency development lesson format for each poem. Students have to read the poems at home and reread them throughout the week. Studies found that students made improvements in reading rate, comprehension, and attitudes towards reading. According to Hawkins, Hale, Sheely, and Ling, incorporating vocabulary instruction into a repeated reading routine can improve and support comprehension. So what are the vocabulary preview cards that are used in this research study? They are words written on index cards with definitions on the back. Students receive them. They read them on their own first. The teacher goes over them with them. And then once the student defines the word 3 times, they move into the repeated reading routines. Purpose and objectives. The purpose of this study is to combine the research on repeated reading approaches and the success of the Poetry Academy with the vocabulary preview cards to create an intervention model that will not only affect reading rate, comprehension, and reading attitude, but also vocabulary. Most of the research found improvements in rate and comprehension as well as attitudes towards reading, but little was found to determine the effect on repeated readings on vocabulary scores. This was the gap in the research that I hoped to fill. My research questions included: will repeated reading of poetry increase scores for reading rate, comprehension, vocabulary, and reading attitudes? And will explicit vocabulary instruction embedded in the repeated reading routines with the vocabulary preview cards and word collector notebooks increase vocabulary and comprehension scores? My hypothesis was that if students read poetry repeatedly, combined with the vocabulary preview cards, that it will positively affect their rate, comprehension, and reading attitudes as well as their vocabulary. The independent variables of the study included the repeated reading of the poetry and the vocabulary instruction. The dependent variables included the reading rate using the scores for reading rate using FAST CBMR grade 3, comprehension scores on the Maze assessment, vocabulary scores on the vocabulary screener, and the reading attitude scores from the reading attitude survey. So, possible impact. If successful, this research, this would provide a short intervention that builds students' skills in 3 of the 5 components of reading according to the National Reading Panel: fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. It will also provide another intervention to add to teachers' toolboxes to work with struggling students on fluency. Methods. So, my school is a Title I elementary school in eastern Iowa. 75% of the students are qualify for free and reduced lunch rate. 26% of the students are considered English language learners. The research sample group included 7 third-grade participants, 3 boys, 4 girls. 2 students were English language learners and receiving ELL instruction. The materials used included a laptop, Microsoft Office, Google Sheets, and JASP. Books included Shel Silverstein and Jack Perletsky books for the poems, index cards, composition notebooks, and folders with brads for organization, and the vocabulary preview cards. Students were selected randomly from a pool of 19 students that were identified using their 2nd grade spring FAST screener scores. This was an A-B research design due to the sample size being so small. Baseline data was compared to treatment A data. Treatment A data was compared to treatment B data. During the baseline assessment period, students were given the CBMR assessment from FastBridge grade 3, the vocabulary screener and Maze assessment from Linda Diamond's Assessing Reading Multiple Measures, and the reading survey from McKenna and Kier. All of these assessments were administered using the administration directions given. All assessments are valid and reliable measures. Data was organized using Google Sheets. In treatment A, students were split into groups. They were seen once a week for 7 minutes each. The teacher followed the following routine with reading the poems. After the first week, the students would read the previous week's poem. Then the teacher would model the new poem. Teacher and student would echo read. Teacher and student would choral read. And then the student would independently read the poem 3 times. After treatment A, all 4 assessments were given again. Then treatment B started. The difference with treatment B is that it began with the vocabulary preview cards using the routine already discussed, then followed by the treatment A's repeated reading of poetry. After treatment B, more data was collected using the same 4 measures. Students received a book for participating in the study, and the students who brought back signatures were given additional books depending on how many signatures they brought back. So the data was analyzed using a paired t-test on JASP. Baseline was compared to treatment A was compared to treatment B, and the significance was determined using the alpha level 500ths. My results. Here are my paired t-test results. The reading rate and vocabulary scores were the only 2 variables significantly influenced by repeated readings in poetry during treatment A. In treatment B, comprehension was the only variable that was significantly affected by the combination of the Poetry Academy and the vocabulary cards. If you look at the means, you can see that the reading attitude and comprehension scores also increased, just not significantly, in treatment A. So all 4 variables saw an increase after treatment A. However, after treatment B, only the reading rate increased, just not significantly, as well as the comprehension. Reading attitudes and vocabularies actually saw a decrease in scores. So the findings did not confirm the hypothesis because the variables were not all significantly improved by the hybrid intervention. Discussion of my findings. So, implications for participants. There are many advantages of the repeated reading routines using poetry. It was engaging and fun. It gave participants a real reason to repeatedly read, and it had smaller teacher-to-student ratio, so the teacher was able to give that immediate feedback right away in a one-on-one session. It exposed students to new and interesting vocabulary, as well as a new form of literature. Most of the students in this research study were super excited to read their poems. It gave them confidence because it was a shorter passage, and when they felt really good about reading a poem, they wanted to share it with other people. They wanted to go take it back to their classroom teachers. They wanted to take it home and read with their parents. The implications for educators include the fact that this was research-based. These routines are research-based, so they could take it to an administrator or an instructional coach and say, hey, look, I want to try this with my students. This is research-based. That's really big right now. Time. These poetry takes so much less time than a traditional reading passage does, so you can work with more students one-on-one in a shorter amount of time. It also influenced a lot of different areas of reading: rate, comprehension, vocabulary, even attitudes. So you're hitting a lot of those different areas that the National Reading Panel wants you to teach in a one-on-one intervention session. The one thing that I learned in this research was the addition of the vocabulary cards had little effect on the 4 variables tested, and that means that I learned that it either meant that the cards were not used as they should have been used, or there was not enough time to teach it as well as it needed to be. Implications for parents. It was an easy way for parents to work with their students at home. Some of my students did take their poems home and they read it with their parents, and it was really easy for their parents to do it. They only had to listen to them read it 2 or 3 times. However, other students, it did not happen. They weren't reading it outside of the tutoring sessions, and that's unfortunate because Poetry Academy's success was the fact that students were reading the poems outside of the tutoring sessions. So most of the students in the study didn't do that even with the incentive of books. The researcher learned that there needs to be an open line of communication between parents and home and classroom teachers and intervention teachers, so everybody knows what is expected and what needs to be done. So, limitations. There was other instruction happening. Some students were receiving interventions in phonics and fluency from other teachers, so it's hard to tell if scores that I received in the research were due to the research intervention or the other interventions. All students were receiving core instruction in multisyllabic phonics skills and fluency using 6-minute solutions. Sample size was really small. There were only 7 students. There were a lot of disruptions during the research period, such as field trips, Iowa assessments, no school days, assemblies. Many weeks the students had to be seen 3 or 4 at a time instead of 2 at a time, and they weren't given that one-on-one attention. So sometimes they would, the modeling and the choral reading and the echo reading all had to be done with the whole group, and then the teacher was able to listen to the students read independently one time instead of the usual 3. It just caused a lot of issues with that. So recommendations. A longer length of study from beginning of the year to the end of the year would really minimize the effect of those disruptions. Yeah, they're going to happen. They always happen. However, there were a lot that happened in that 13 weeks. Having it for the whole school year would make a big difference, and those wouldn't affect it as much as it did, probably. A larger group of students would allow there to be more representative of the grade being studied, as well as having a control comparison group of students that are only getting core instruction, so you can compare a control group and the intervention group, and having a longer tutoring session instead of 7 minutes, push it to 10 to 12 minutes to incorporate those vocabulary cards more fully might show a difference in scores after introducing the vocabulary cards. And then finding a better accountability system so students are rehearsing their poems outside of those tutoring sessions. Having that open line of communication at home and in the classroom would really help. Thank you for listening. Here are my references.